Welcome to the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. In this series, we'll bring you 12 of the best talks from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime. This episode is called COVID-19 and Organised Crime.
Welcome, everyone. This panel is titled COVID-19 and Organised Crime. My name is Anna Laskai. I'm Assistant Professor of Criminology at Utrecht University, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel today, in which we'll be seeing three presentations discussing organized criminality and with a specific focus on how COVID-19 has affected means, motives, and opportunity structures of groups, as well as the types of criminality that may flourish during the global pandemic or within a global crisis. Before I introduce the speakers of the first presentation, let me just briefly reiterate some technical rules of engagement. So please mute your microphones when you are not presenting or not speaking. Presentations will be a maximum of about 15 minutes, and I will let you know when you're at the 10-minute mark so that you can begin wrapping up your presentations. And the presentations will take place after each other. At the end of all three, I'll open the floor to questions from the participants. As such, during the presentation, please take note of your questions, make use of the chat, place the questions in there, and then I will be posing these to our presenters at the end of all the presentations. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the first presenters. We are joined today by Mr. Stephen Asare-Abankwa and Mr. King Carl Kornam-Duo, economists and policy analysts from deepening Research Lab and deepening Consulting from Accra, Ghana. Stephen and King Carl, welcome. The floor is yours.
Hi to everyone. I'm Stephen Asare-Abankwa, and our focus is on the impact of COVID-19 on organized crime in Ghana and insights for a post-pandemic context. This is the outline of our presentation. First off, we'll look at the motivation, the literary view. We'll explore policies on organized crime in Ghana. We'll look at organized crime and COVID marriage, terrorist expansion, the sub-region, policy loopholes, how to integrate regional and global stances into national policy stances, and then conclusion and recommendation. First off, the twin issues of terrorism and organized crime are becoming entrenched across Africa. And given the US UNODC, GI-TOC report about criminality scores within Africa, what we do find is that 48% of countries in the region have high criminality scores, greater than 5.0, indicating there's high prevalence of criminal markets and high scale and scope of criminal activities. For Ghana's criminality score, we do find that it's around 6.04, which shows that it's highly affected by the activities of organized criminal groups. Now, that is also conjoined with the fact that in 2020, Ghana went to the polls, and this was amid the second wave of the COVID-19, and reports came out that Ghana, the election campaigns were fueled with illicit financing sources. Again, typical with the COVID-19 crisis situation, we do also find that organized criminal groups were able to undergo some mutations where due to the disruptions of COVID-19, the stay-at-home measures and mobility restrictions meant that it disrupted businesses, and so therefore businesses were supposed to then swiftly move away from the traditional ways of doing business into other means. Again, organized criminal groups were able to then reroute their networks so that they maneuver the challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic had posed on their activities. Catching up on these new challenges, and of course, with regards to the threats of terror activities, what it means is that the government is supposed to look at organized criminal activities and how to clamp down on them holistically and identify the policy loopholes and regulatory loopholes that are within the system in order to clamp down on organized criminal activities in the country. There are a number of theories that seek to identify and elaborate for us what organized criminal activities, what are the motivations really for organized criminal activities. And the individual and structural strain theory says that there may be some negative feelings and stress or anger that may fuel or motivate individuals or contribute to their involvement in organized criminal activity, especially in issues or cases where there are crises, right? And there's also the strain of theory, which also says that there's an opportunity and routine activity. That is when day-to-day movements of people are curtailed due to the lockdown measures that were put in place. What it means is that individuals are not able to, those who are involved in organized criminal activities are not able to go about their normal activities. And so it tends to reduce or contribute less to the number of or frequency of organized criminal activities occurring in the country. For the first theory, it means that given that people are faced with crisis situations and it leads to stress, negative influences, and anger, then it means that it will fuel their involvement in organized criminal activity, which is to them going to impact positively on them, whilst they involve themselves in that activity. But for the other one, which is the opportunity and routine activity theory, it means that given the lockdown measures, it would rather reduce organized criminal activities. We then now move on to exploring policies in Ghana, which regarding organized crime as well. For our national policies, what we do find is that they are mainly born out from the international conventions and treaties and agreements, as well as the regional agreements that have been signed and ratified in Ghana. But what we do also find is that these policies in fighting organized criminal activities are rather skewed hugely towards law enforcement, that is strengthening law and order. The most important thing that we need to note about our policies in Ghana is that in 2010, the government established the EOCO, which is the Economic Office of Organized, Crime Office, where it was established such that it would prevent and detect organized crime and also confiscate proceeds of crime. In 2020, and in 2019 and 2020, the government was placed, or Ghana was placed under the FATF grey list, which pointed out that the policies regarding anti-money laundering and CTL were loose. And so it meant that individuals were able to use these loopholes to involve themselves in, this money laundering and what have you. But in that same year, in 2020, due to that that occurrence, the government introduced some regulatory frameworks and then some policies to be able to remove or get Ghana off that list. So in 2020, the government amended the AML Act of 2008. And then also it introduced a national anti-money laundering and countering the financing terrorism policy between 2019 and 2022. And they also revised some guidelines for banks and non-bank financial institutions to be able to clamp down on this menace. Also, it's also interesting to note that in 2022, the government launched a national drug control master plan as a framework to control the occurrence or the use of or trafficking of drug within the country, which is something laudable to note. Now, with regards to organized crime and then COVID, we know that Ghana, from time immemorial, has been touted as a country that has a stable democracy. But Ghana is no saint when it comes to, organized criminal activities or the frequency of occurrence of organized crime. Now, in the COVID-19 period, what we did find is that statistics show that human trafficking and the sales of illicit drugs increased by about 133% and 100% respectively between 2019 and 2020. And again, during the COVID period, due to lockdown measures that were imposed within the urban centers, that is specifically Accra and then Kumasi, what we did find was that, of course, crime increased. And this is something that has always been the case for these urban cities. Now, the pandemic drove consumers to, instead of seeking for the traditional use of doing business, they rather sought to contract transactions using, online means and all that. And what it meant was that ATM and point of sales related fraud increased by about 548% year over year. That is between 2019 and 2020, which is a significant percentage regarding the occurrence of this fraudulent activities. And so the theory which says that, due to lockdown measures, it would reduce the spate of the organized criminal activities occurring. It wasn't the case. Rather, what we did see is that individuals were moved from those traditional means into the use of online means to conduct their illicit activities. During the pandemic, as well as I said earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic was also coupled with the 2020 elections. And what we did see is that during that period, individuals or groups that are involved in organized criminal activities were they were involved in philanthropic activities because the vulnerable who were not able to cater for themselves became poor, of course. So these people shared foods around to be able to help these others. And what it meant was that it was a means of eroding the state of power in the local level. That is, traditional rulers and leaders are now not able to talk as much as possible, or we don't even see their involvement when it comes to illegal mining, which has become a menace in the country. Terrorist expansion also, increased during the period. And UNODC has said that close to half of the world's terror activities occur in Africa. And most of these terrorist groups, mainly Boko Haram and others which have moved from the Sahel region, have gotten into West Africa. And these are causing some kind of panic and threats within the region. We have seen that Burkina Faso has recorded some number of terrorist threats. We've also seen that Togo has been affected as well. And then there are also, people saying that Ghana could be the next. And in fact, there are reports that indicate that there are jihadists that have already moved into Ghana. And so the government is supposed to move in quickly to be able to curb this menace. Again, UNODC noted that illegally mined gold and other precious metals are fueling violent criminal activities. And these are sources of income for these people and groups. And Ghana being involved in mining and being able to produce gold in large quantities, and of course, having the issue of illegal mining being a real canker in the country, it means that these people may move in and be involved in this to fuel the financing of their activities. And so the government is supposed to also look into that as well. Now, there are some policy loopholes in addressing organized crime. For Ghana's policies regarding organized crime, what we do find is that they are rarely linked with other core support areas. And they are merely emphasizing just the law enforcement agenda, right? Strengthening law and order in the country and advancing security mainly. But what Enact Africa's Resilience Index report says about Ghana is that given the report, the resilience mechanisms that it used as an index, it's Ghana's resilience score reduced to 0.08. And given the 12 indices that it used, 4 of them showed a negative improvement, 4 of them showed no change at all, and then 4 of them showed some marginal improvement. Now, there's also some level of policy incoherence and lack of coordination among the implementing agencies in Ghana involved to control the menace. And there are also some accountability and transparency measures which are not very robust. And so these organized criminal groups and illicit trade and all that do happen. And especially this is found in the areas of the electoral financing or electoral campaigns. And as I said earlier, it was mentioned during the 2020 elections. There's also policy responses are also nearly knee-jerk, especially when you do find the illegal mining activities, what the government has done so far regarding fighting it. During 2017, the government sought to do that. But so now we still have this as a great menace, and it's been a very big headache for the government and then the president as a person. And also corruption has also been on the increase, even though policy responses have been done to be able to curb it. They have only been immediate and not really structured to be able to solve this menace. Again, what we did seek to do is that we adopted the use of the policy outcome indicator of the Office of the Auditor General and Ministry of Justice to be able to help us know what's for the government, what it seeks about its fight against organized criminal activities in the country. And we used the IOCO, which is the agency given the full mandate to do that. And doing an analysis, what we did find is that from the graph you see, we used the percentage of cases investigated by IOCO and then as against the total number of cases they received, and then the percentage of cases they prosecuted. And when you look at the graph here, you see that from 2018 to 2021, we saw a huge decrease of the percentage of cases investigated by IOCO from 60% to 42%, a massive decrease. And then again, when you look at the percentage of cases prosecuted by IOCO, we found a massive decrease from 2018, which is 66.7%, to 42.2% in 2021, telling us that there has been some effect of the COVID-19 on the activities, on the fact that policies have been loose, regulatory measures have been loose, implementation has been very, very loose within that period. And of course, because of the move of these organized criminal groups onto the online markets, it means that they are wherewithal to be able to curb this menace is also suspect. Now, integrating regional and global stances into national policy stances. We also do realize that Ghana, as I said earlier, looks at the global and regional conventions and treaties and draws its policies from that. But again, it's also worthy to note that global initiatives that were previously dominating the responses to organized criminal activities are now taking the back stage. Now, what we do find is that regional initiatives are beginning to take center stage, and that is what Banfield says. But of course, given the rising political uncertainties and the fact that there's deglobalization, countries more and more are seeking to tilt towards going solo instead of, looking at and sacrificing multilateral cooperation with other bodies and countries. But of course, to be able to integrate regional and global stances, international policy stances, what it means is that since there's a transnational dynamics to organized crime, we should look at this problem as a globally localized problem so that we tailor policies in that direction. So there's a need for increased multilateral cooperation, unlike the other case, which seeks to mean that governments will only look inward and only amongst their own counterparts in their regions to look at solving this menace. There's supposed to be increased multilateral cooperation, which is dwindling as time goes on. And that's the case also with Ghana, especially with the comprehensive national drug control that it launched. It came by from the ECOWAS that really helped, brought the initiative up and supported the government to be able to do this. Of course, the multilateral corporations were at the background, but that is what we saw. But to be able to solve this issue, there's supposed to be increased multilateral cooperation. Of course, notwithstanding the regional corporations also being important. Now, let's focus on the...
Stephen, I'm sorry, you have 1 more minute.
Right. So we see that from what we've discussed, there are increased threats of terrorism and illicit networks that are occurring within Ghana. And of course, these organized criminal groups have shifted their focus into the region and particularly to the country. What the government needs to do is that they should, given the increased political will in committing to reducing this menace, the government should also correct institutional constraints, which are human, financial, and logistically induced. The first thing to do is that the government should develop a comprehensive national master control and plan to address the different forms of organized criminal activities in Ghana. Again, there should be the government should also prioritize closing the gaps in existing policies regarding organized criminal activities and the convergence it has with crisis situations. Policy coherence and coordination should also be of priority to the government. Again, we see that there's also a dearth in data on crime, which therefore does not allow the government to fully respond to organized criminal activities occurring in the country. And so there's need for more research and data to be able to help the government do some complete review of policies and formulation of policies to guide its planning and address wholly organized criminal activities in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen and King Carl. A very extensive presentation with a number of subjects, which I'm sure will give a lot of opportunity for discussion at the end of this. For now, I'd like to move on to the second presentation. This is a study by Marco Dugato and Cosimo Sidotti. Today we have Cosimo here, researcher at the Transcrime Research Center, as well as works at the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore. Cosimo, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about the research that I carried out together with my colleague Marco Dugato. Our research, talking about our research called Organized Theft of Medicines, Emerging Trends and Criminal Schemes. So the first issue that we encounter about this topic is the one about definition. So what is exactly theft of medicines? So we want a definition basically that focus more on serious and organized criminal events rather than petty offenses, such as, for instance, individuals going to steal medicines in pharmacy shops because of personal usage. So we opted for the following definition. Theft of medicines refers to any illegal taking of medicines or medical devices, usually perpetrated by organized criminal groups or networks, and in which the aim of the criminals is either to reintroduce illicitly stolen products into the legal supply chain or to sell them on the black market. So why it is relevant today, theft of medicines? So what we know is that medicines are an appealing target with low risk and high returns. This is because of the specific characteristics of medicines that are low of volume and weight, but at the same time have high commercial value. And this is the case for specific medicines, for instance, those to treat severe diseases such as cancer medicines, but also for some medical devices, for instance, endoscopes or optic medical instruments. Then we know that theft of medicines has huge impacts in terms of economic impacts. So here, for instance, from this graphic, from this data from the Transporter Association, we can see that the percentage of pharmaceutical theft with a value of more than of 100,000 or more is quite bigger than compared to the major thefts of other products in proportion to the total number of cargo crimes. So when we talk about theft of medicines here, we are talking about mostly major crimes with a huge economic impact. However, another relevant impact is certainly about, obviously, the public health, the health of citizens. So another relevant aspect is that theft of medicines are usually largely underreported or misreported. So we don't have much information about that. And usually theft of medicines are reported as just generic theft. For instance, here from the data of the Pharmaceutical Security Institute, we can see that at first glance, theft of medicines is a minor issue with very low percentages. However, very interesting here is the percentage about the diversion cases that actually account for the most reported pharmaceutical crime events. And this means, it is interesting because this means that actually diverted products are most likely to be generated from some sort of fraud or theft. So this means that the high number of diversion cases could entail a high number of unreported theft of medicines. So diversion cases are an additional indication of the number of theft of medicines. And lastly, another very much relevance is about the consequences of the COVID-19 and also most recently the war in Ukraine and the sanctions to Russia because of obviously because they generated new opportunities for criminals to boost even more further this illegal market. So in our research, what we do basically, our research falls within a broader project called MediTheft, that is a EU-funded project, where as researchers our role was to collect and analyze information related to theft of medicines, with the aim of identifying and prevent the modus operandi of criminals. And the ultimate end of this project was to create a data sharing and investigative platform to combat organized theft of medicines at EU level, to better improve effective EU law enforcement intervention. In our identification of the criminals schemes, we used a variety of sources to collect data coming from databases provided by the Pharmaceutical Security Institute and TAPA, Transported Asset Protection Association, but also the Italian Medicine Agency and Carabinieri. We carried out surveys administered to drug regulatory agencies in most EU member states. We carried out interviews with key experts in the private and public sector, and we also analyzed more than 1,000 records among press releases and journal articles, and we lastly analyzed also 6 official documents on judicial cases about theft of medicines or medical devices in Italy. So we in our analysis, we identified specifically 7 criminal schemes, relying upon a crime script analysis approach. And these criminal schemes are 5 related to specifically medicines, and the last 2 about medical devices. So the first one, and probably the most common one, is international illicit traders. That is inspired about the Operation Vulcano case in 2014 that occurred in Italy, and this scheme has the aim to steal large quantities of high-priced medicines, so mostly cancer medicines, to re-enter them into the legal supply chain in other EU member states through parallel trading. However, this particular scheme does not occur much. It's not that common nowadays because of a higher traceability of medicines. And more common today is actually the second scheme that we call suppliers, where the aim here is to steal low quantities of high-priced medicines on commission to export them in countries where these products are not available or not covered by the national health systems. And this scheme, for instance, was very common in North African countries as destination countries, where European medicines are very much attractive. Then we have the third scheme that is about generalists with the aim of stealing large or medium quantities of low-priced medicines or common medical devices to furnish local pharmacies or private medical facilities. Here, the main actors are usually conniving professionals that coordinate all these organizations, and at the same time they are the same to furnish their own local pharmacies. And it is so compared to the previous 2, it has a much more local type of market. Then we have the recyclers that is quite less common, and it is about counterfeiting. So the aim here is to steal expired medicines or pharmaceutical waste to provide organization of counterfeiters with samples or materials about new or highly requested products. And here we saw some cases, for instance, in north of Italy, where thieves were stealing outside from the waste disposal of medicines outside hospitals or pharmacies. Then we have the dealers scheme about stealing medical products that could be used in illicit or recreational activities to sell them on the black market. So here we are talking, for instance, about anabolic steroids, so in gyms or sex shops and stuff like that. And then the last two are about medical devices. So here we have the technicians scheme that is about stealing high-priced medical devices or equipment and sell them abroad, either on the black market or on the secondary market. And here we saw, for instance, a case involving a gang outside Europe coming into Europe to steal specifically endoscopes and bring them back to their own country to sell them either on the black market, or as secondary items. Then we have the last scheme, that is the one that is the most current, probably because it involves COVID-19, especially where the aim is to steal large amounts of low-priced medical devices with a wide demand in the general public, to sell them either on the black market or to conniving or unwitting legal businesses. And we saw these, for instance, very attractive in this period, where the face masks, for instance. In conclusion, we summarizing them, after having analyzed these criminal schemes, we could identify the main characteristics of theft of medicines. So, for instance, first of all, theft of medicines is widespread and transnational. So, even though there is a lack of available information, we know that theft of medicines and medical devices occur in most countries across Europe, and most of the criminal schemes highlight the transnational nature of this crime. Not only considering where the countries where the medicines were stolen, but also where these medicines were transited and sold as well. We also know that theft of medicines is a complex crime because it involves and connects a wide range of activities, illicit activities, beyond the mere stealing of the products, and the level of complexity varies according to the specific characteristics of the criminal schemes, such as, for instance, the quantity and type of medicines, of stolen products, the economic profits generated, but also the cross-border nature of the trafficking of these products. Then we know that theft of medicines is an organized crime, because to manage this complexity, criminals' activities tend to be decentralized to specific functional units, such as thieves, transporters, fences, and retailers. They are usually coordinated by a management group in charge of brokering and coordinating the different actors. And especially in the case of major crimes, so yielding high profits, these criminal organizations are highly entrepreneurial and extremely market-oriented. Then we know that theft of medicines is various and evolving. So they identify criminal schemes highlight how thieves can target different products, rely on different and various methods for stealing these products, and also exploit several channels to sell them both to witting or unwitting clients. And obviously, this opens a wide range of opportunities for criminals operating in this illicit market. So that allows them to target different alternative products, or places, mainly based on opportunistic reasons. Then, as a last point, in conclusion, we know that theft of medicines is often facilitated by conniving professionals. So these criminal organizations rely heavily on conniving professionals or employees or brokers along the pharmaceutical supply chain, and these are crucial actors in most of the schemes, connecting the criminal organizations to the clients. So these actors take advantage of their occupations to steal and facilitate the stealing of the products, and based also on their expertise, they also can establish whitewash mechanisms and broker and also broker activities between, as I was saying before, between criminals and clients, in order to sell these stolen products. And third, these actors can also help to set up a bogus company or shell companies.
Cosimo, you have 1 moment.
I basically concluded. Or also, to set up this bogus company or mediate with conniving ones to favor the stealing. And that's pretty much it. And if you want to know more, we are going to release soon, next week, the report that we wrote about the theft of medicine in the EU, and you can email us or find the website or on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cosimo. That was quite enlightening. And I'd like to encourage, I see a couple of questions already in the chat. Please keep them coming, because we'll pose these at the end to all of the presenters and also individually. For our final presentation, I would like to welcome Lorenzo Vertemati. He has an extensive and very international background when it comes to his studies, studying international studies in The Hague, looking specifically at Africa, and then later within the Erasmus Plus program with an international master in security, intelligence and strategic studies. He has conducted research in Glasgow, Dublin, and Prague, and his interests lie now with criminal groups and the interrelationship between security and society. So your master thesis focused on the effects of COVID-19 and organized criminal groups in Italy. So Lorenzo, I would like to give you the floor for the final presentation.
Thank you. So yes, this is the title of my presentation, which is also the title of my dissertation for the University of Glasgow. As you can see, I have a focus on the relationship between COVID-19 and Italian organized crime groups. So I mainly focus on the three main ones. So 'Ndrangheta in Calabria, mafia in Sicily, and then in Campania there's Camorra. So this is the structure of the presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about research design and methodology. I'm going to talk about literature review, so where I got my ideas, especially for the variables that I used. And of course, then I'm going to mention the variables for the relationship between COVID-19 and organized crime, talk about the actual impact, which is the critical part of my presentation, and then I'm going to give out a bit of a conclusion. Thank you. So this is just an idea about the research design and the methodologies that I've used. It is, of course, an historical event research. So I took one event that goes on for 2 years. Arguably, it is still going on. Is it not going on? That's another kind of debate. But I did focus on the period between 2020 and July 2022, which is when I finished my research. I used 11 variables. I did employ a critical approach to this dissertation, and I wanted to do that especially, which is the main motivation also for my writing, which is that I've noticed, especially doing research on this subject, that there's a lot of bias and especially assumptions, in my opinion, from the academic world especially, but also from the general public regarding the actual impact of organized crime and its effect, in my opinion, especially in Italy. So I wanted to try and understand whether that was actually the case or it was the product of exaggerated bias and assumption. So I mainly used secondary sources, but also primary ones. It's a mixed method approach, which is what I found most useful in this type of research. Of course, there are a lot of academic articles among them, but I also went on databases by the Italian police or the Italian government. That's the main ones, but there are also institutions in the EU and of course all around the world. The topic of the generalizations is a hard one in this case, because there's a lot of debate about whether you can make generalizations regarding such a big research. I wouldn't agree with making them, and in my opinion, it's especially because of the country of focus. It's a case study in the end, and the country of focus is Italy, which is an outlier, in my opinion, when you're talking about organized crime. So it wouldn't be too wise for what concerns my thoughts to generalize a situation like this one for the rest of the world. So yeah, I identified the 11 variables that I use for the research using these three main points for the literature review. The first one is the relationship between organized crime and crisis around the world. So I had a look at economic, political, and environmental crisis. I wanted to see how organized crimes and organized crime groups and crisis were interrelated, and how they were studied before, of course, if there were any points of contact that I could employ for my research as well. The second one, which is most important in my case, is the relationship between organized crime groups and crisis in Italy. So in particular, in this case, it was important for me to look at the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, but also the political crisis of the 1990s in Italy, especially from 1992, the environmental crisis. So, for example, the earthquakes that were in southern Italy, central and southern Italy in the 80s, and of course migration, with 2015 being the point here. There is the last point, of course, is the relationship between organized crimes and COVID around the world. So I wanted to look how that relationship was studied and what it entailed around the world, to then bring it and see if I could bring back anything into Italy. Okay, so I started looking at the socio-political activities of organized crime groups in Italy during COVID. Of course, I first looked at corruption, which increased by 94% between 2020 and 2021. In the year prior, Italy also lost a spot in the Transparency International's index and is currently at the 52nd place, which is not too bad, of course, but it's also not one of the best positions that supposedly developed country, as we pride ourselves to call us, should be. So of course, I studied the exploitation and redirection of police resources. In this case, it mainly concerned prison. There is a 20% prison overpopulation in Italy, and 10% of the prison population was released to alleviate the pressure from COVID, which is something that really wasn't useful in the end, mainly because of the ways that these people, which were mainly convicted for mafia, so organized crimes, then they used the house arrest that they were put in to call their associates, or organize plans for robberies, or to deal drugs or humans, you know. So it had really a negative effect on the overall security of southern Italy. There's a provision of social support, of course, whereby these groups actually created fake charities, and they went around in southern Italy, especially in poorer settlements, giving out aid to people so that they would be in debt with them. Of course, there is the exploitation of the online sphere, which is socio-political, but it's also an economic issue. Facebook and Twitter have been used 70% more during the pandemic in Italy than before. And of course, there is an increase in attacks, roughly 60% increase in attacks by malware and botnets on Italian servers. That is something that concerns also organized crime. There is a debate in this sense, whether it is established organized crime groups like mafia or camorra might be undertake these attacks, or it's actually smaller, younger, more flexible cells of criminals that are independent from the bigger groups. So there is a debate about this. Thank you. So yeah, just touching briefly on the economic activities of organized crime groups during COVID. The main one that we want to look at is the appropriation of public funds. Of course, there is the Next Generation EU fund, which was worth 750 billion euros. And 190 of them, which is the highest number in Europe, were allocated to Italy. And they will be delivered up until 2026, and they will be spread out on 6 years, of course. 25 billion, so 13% was obtained immediately, which gave, of course, a big chance to organized crime groups in Italy, which already had an expertise in this field, to take advantage of the situation. And I go back to the previous slide with corruption. Of course, you have to put these two numbers together and try to understand the scale of the significance. You can see also there's a 4% increase of white-collar crimes, which implied that they were stealing public funds, but they were also stealing private ones. One of their preferred ways to do this, for example, was stealing private information. So they were doing that from individuals, they were doing that from companies, and then they were making out orders for them, or picking up product that they had ordered previously, and that they could sell on the black market, for a higher price or something like that. So another part of the economic activities, of course, is the infiltration of the economic system, which is something that I was talking about before. You have to understand that there is a large part of the Italian economy that already before the crisis was at risk of being involved with organized crime. Roughly 11% was already in the hands of the mafia before. 10% wasn't, but was at risk. So roughly 20% already before COVID. This is something that, of course, increased afterwards. One of the most interesting numbers, in my opinion, is the fact that 10% more companies were affected by anti-mafia interdicting measures, which is something that we have in Italy since the 1990s and the political crisis that I was talking about before, to avoid the capture of the Italian legal, political, economic system by these groups. Of course, the other really interesting number, in my opinion, is the fact that 60% of Italian regions experienced increases in financial crimes during COVID. One interesting fact is also where that happened, because most of the regions that experienced large increases in this sense were not in the south, as is traditionally expected, but they were in the north. In fact, the region that had the highest increase in percentage was Trentino Alto Adige, which is a region in northeastern Italy that traditionally really has nothing to do with mafia. So it was really interesting for this. Of course, the last economic activity that organized crime groups undertook was usury, which is something that is, well, it's almost a tradition in Italy, let's say. But from 2019 to 2020, the practice increased by 7.5%, which is a really high number, and that mainly happened because of the liquidity that was available to organized crime groups. So in a situation where there was an economic crisis because of COVID and people didn't have access either to their savings or to banks, in a lot of situations, because of their credit score, of course, but in a lot of situations, people turn to organized crime groups even for what is called daily usury. So I borrow money in the morning and I give them back at night. Of course, that comes with higher interest rates that a lot of times touch 100 or 200%. So that's something definitely to be worried about, especially for the lower classes in Italian society. The third thing that I looked at was trafficking and smuggling. Of course, first among them is drug trafficking, which is something that has been practiced for a lot of years by Italian organized crime groups. There is an increase in narcotic seized from 2020 to 2021 by 55%, and especially the previous year, cocaine increased by 60%, which is a really high number. There is also an increase in human trafficking, plus 50%. That is a number that was given by the US embassy in Italy, actually. And there is an interesting fact, that is the number of migrants arriving to Europe from the Mediterranean route, which is the one that leads to Italy, actually increased, whereby the overall number of migrants decreased. But I'm going to talk about that later. And of course, there is the trafficking and smuggling of counterfeits. But I think that Mr. Sidotti already talked extensively about that. Now, I wanted to touch a little bit on the impact. And this is the critical part of my research, in my opinion. I wanted to do this, and I wanted to touch on whether the impact was actually what the researchers experienced, for a very simple reason, and that is because I have experience, I've seen, as any other Italian has, the effects that policies prepared by a government that is not well informed about certain issues and securitizes certain issues without the need to, can actually have a negative effect on the government, on the population, and on the overall security of the country. So just to give an example, I'm thinking of the security decree that was established in 2018, if I'm not wrong, against migrants. So yeah, that was a very big thing, and it brought like a lot of stress in Italy. I did want to try and avoid that, and especially look at the bias of researchers when looking at this topic. But just starting off, I touched on the counterfeits, which again, Mr. Sidoli talked about a lot, but counterfeits have been a priority for the European Union in the fight against organized crime since at least 2010, arguably since 2013, when the first actual policy was published against them, and the first suggestions for member states were published. Of course, there is the impact on the investments in the legal economy and the healthcare business. So I do agree that corruption increased, of course, by 94%, and that's a high number. But 500 billion were already lost annually to before COVID-19 to organized crime. And in the end, we are 52nd in the transparency index, but Italy only lost one spot, which arguably can be said out of 193 that is not such a bad deal in the end. Of course, even with the confiscation of properties, as I was talking about before, that is something that has been going on since the 1990s. There are billions that have been confiscated since then. And the number, in fact, during COVID has increased, but it hasn't increased as much as researchers were expecting before the crisis. And the actual percentage of property changes for Italian companies actually remained the same between 2019 and 2020, which suggests that there hasn't been such a big attempt by organized crime to take advantage of the situation as well, at least in this respect. As far as usury impact, as I talked about before, usury is a practice that is traditionally practiced in Italy. It's a big part of Italian transactions, and it's something that has been practiced more and more, at least since the 2007-2008 financial crisis. So of course you have to put it into perspective. As far as trafficking and smuggling, yes, it has increased. The number of drugs have increased arriving into Italy, but mainly because of COVID. The percentage of drug-related offenses went down. So at least for the perception of people on the ground, they did feel more secure about it. There of course was a big trade volume around fake medication, of course, before COVID, and there is little organized crime groups involvement in migrant smuggling. There is a missing word there, but what I mean by it is that what is traditionally thought is that organized crime groups in Italy are the ones actually organizing and carrying out the migrant smuggling, which is something that doesn't happen. They only enable it. They allow the smugglers to operate on their territory. So we have to put that into perspective too. And overall, roughly 50% less migrants arrived in Europe from 2019 to 2020. Finally, society and politics. The way that the bosses were treated in prison, the way that they behaved around the streets, that was all counterproductive in their way. They tried to win the population by giving them food, but I mean their behavior as bosses, as mafia bosses, and as criminals did fire back in the end, and the perception of people, especially on social media, really changed in the end. Just a conclusion, I established that only 2 out of 10 actually increased and expanded during COVID for organized crime groups, and those are the appropriation of public public state and EU funds, and the exploitation of the online sphere, of course. As for the others, I do find that a lot of them are a development of past achievements, like usury or the sale and production of counterfeits might be, while some might be even like radical changes in shifting businesses, or just plainly not as effective as they thought they would be, like their socio-political operations that I just mentioned.
Thank you very much for that. I think first off, I'm just going to look at the chat for some questions that have been posed by the audience. So I have one from Diane. I think this is for Cosimo. She asks, do the European entities collaborate with the National Healthcare Anti-Fraud Association in the US?
I cannot tell you with certainty, but one of the things is about also the project is the lack of harmonization between all states, also outside Europe. So I will be very surprised if that would happen. I mean, as I was saying in my presentation, is very much underreported. So, and there isn't collaboration between, but also between the same country, within the same country. Yeah, that's really one of the main issue about theft of medicine, the lack of collaboration.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for you, actually, Cosimo. So Sophie asks, could you enlighten us with a case study?
Yes, so there are several. So the one of the suppliers, for instance, that usually work with basically a client so we have, for instance, rich client in North Africa that wants to have a cancer medicine in Europe. So they basically work with these conniving professional. They commission, they ask for this medicine to this conniving professional, this healthcare professional, and these actors work as brokering. So they commission a type of a specific medicine to thieves in Europe that steal these medicines, and then they ship from in Europe. They usually ship these medicines either through postal services or simply by traveling, so putting these medicines inside their luggage, and then that's it. It's not very complicated, unfortunately. And that's on the black market. Then we have also within the legal market with so whitewashing, for instance, setting up bogus companies, shell companies, with so creating fake transaction to whitewash these medicines and reintroduce them in the legal supply chain.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Again, I encourage everyone to place their questions in the chat as we have this discussion. But for the time being, I have a question of my own. There was many of you mentioned a variety of crimes that are happening, some things that have become more prominent during COVID, some crimes which perhaps increase within a crisis situation. And I think it was both Stephen and King Carl, as well as Lorenzo, mentioned cybercrime. And I think this is one of the big questions, especially that came up during the pandemic. Since we were all at home, spending more time on the internet, obviously there's kind of a shift towards more crimes being committed online. I'm curious, within your research, do you see that traditional organized criminal groups and the crimes that they engage in? Are these simply moving online, or are there now new crimes being actually committed online? It's quite a broad question, but I'm hoping perhaps Stephen or King Carl, do you have a comment on that?
So for the Ghanaian case, what has happened was that during the COVID, during the lockdown time, there was the need for movement for some of the people there was some kind of migration or displacement among the people. And what it meant is that before some of these organizations can meet up, they have to go online. So there was some kind of online engagement to some extent. But then we have not put up specific data to pull up to what percentage of that has happened. But then also for the fact that we saw the move towards the use of cyber-related financial tools, the cryptocurrencies, and then the various online systems, we see that is also something which is possible in that. In Ghana, there have been some threats or traits of mafia groups, but not higher level radical groups per se, but more mild. But then we see that in the mining communities where they engage in artisanal mining, which we call galamsey, they have been increasing radicalism in those contexts. But then it is something that we aim to explore further.
I see, thank you. I think, Lorenzo, the same question for you. What did you see in your research?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. I actually agree with King Carl. I do think that we have to discern between actual cybercrime and cyber tools that are used to commit other types of crimes. So I think that's very important. What I mentioned before, for example, the stealing of information in the end is not employed for a cybercrime in itself, but you do use cyber tools to steal certain information. So of course, it's part of a larger strategy. There are tools right now that allow individuals, small groups, but also organized criminal groups to undertake bigger operations in the cybersphere. And especially, in my opinion, it's important the nature of the cybersphere itself. We might not see a big increase now. I do believe that there's going to be one in the future, especially in relation to the lack of accountability, the fact that you have a lot of people that are not affiliated with the nation state that can work very well on a computer and can endanger a nation state or its institutions just by using a tool that I'm using and you're using right now. So you only need knowledge. It's kind of an asymmetric warfare, but we have to see also where the technological developments bring us in the future.
Thank you. I'm not sure if there's any comments on that or follow-up questions. But also another thing that got me thinking while I was listening to all of your presentations is the way in which organized crime groups, specifically within the pandemic, have also emerged in a sense of fulfilling a social need. We spoke about, or I think you mentioned that they were handing out of, let's say, PPEs. I know that in Italy, this was the Italian mafia was handing out personal protective equipment, sometimes food perhaps, or even money. And I think King Khan and Stephen, you also mentioned this as well. And I'm wondering, this fulfilling of a societal need, how difficult does it make it for governments actually to respond to organized crime? Because at the same time, you have these organizations which technically are trying to solidify their legitimacy by helping society. So I'm kind of wondering, does it make it more difficult for governments to counteract, and how?
Yeah, so maybe just for some few comments. For the Ghanaian case, what happened was that during the COVID, you see a lot of engagement for philanthropism, and where the president actually even called for all people, all should come on board and then donate for various activities. Actually, there have been an infectious disease center that was built within a very short space of time, with a very efficient use of resources, with the military helping to build within that period. And what happens is that the money has to be mobilized from all sources. And sometimes these kind of groups are not, they don't operate in silo, they operate with politically exposed people. And then they connect in such some ways or the other with some of these people. So yeah, there are those possibilities that the ability for government to be able to address those issues. And for our context in Ghana, for example, there are sometimes that because the person who is committing a crime is affiliated with the existing the government in power, some kind of sanction from the IOCO or from the national security may not be done. And what also happened was that during the COVID, that was when a lot of the national security organizations have to go in, the apparatus have to go in pursuing. Some people were moving when they say don't move, there was you don't have to move, and some people were moving, some people have to be arrested. But then we saw some cases where there were even sometimes forceful and unprofessional behavior from some of these security operatives. And that's when some of the bad nuts come in pretending to be official. So some of those things are key. The sad part is that our part of the world, the critical sophistication and the research-oriented security work addressing criminal issues that we have to do, we have not gotten there yet. We talk about cyber security, but in Ghana, we have not gotten there yet. It's sad, but then that is the case, and we hope that discussions would get to the level that we'll be able to start addressing some of this.
Yeah, if I can get, I don't know if I can get into that. I actually have, because we have something similar in Italy as something like political enablers. Here is called a gray zone, zona grigia, which is something like it's a zone in which there's people that are in between legality and illegality, which are kind of the intermediaries between politicians or like legitimate businessmen and the criminals, so by all means, not every time the goals of the state and the groups are not aligned. Sometimes they actually do align. In this case, as you can see, of course, it is beneficial also for the state to have their people's belly full, or to have them wear masks, even if it's the organized crime groups that enforce them. In the case of Italy, I still wouldn't think so. I didn't see any proof for organized crime groups' total control of territories that they didn't control before. So where they were able to apply these policies are only places where police already had troubles before the pandemic. It didn't change much in that respect. And as I mentioned in my conclusions also, in Italy, there was of course, that helped organized crime groups with their legitimacy, helping people out, of course. But on the other hand, you also had the privileges by organized crime groups, and especially their members, especially higher ups in the ladder, that were able to go home from prison, call their families, or the restrictions, so a curfew didn't apply to them, for example, and they could do whatever they wanted, which is something that in the end really angered the population. So that was really counterproductive.
Yeah, and unfortunately we don't have too much time left, but I was going to reflect a little bit also on Cosimo's presentation, that this must be quite a struggle when it comes to the illicit medicines market, because at the same time you have these organized crime groups addressing an unmet social need, which, for example, can be access to medicines or getting medicines at a lower price. So that definitely, I think perhaps that's something you've seen as well in your research, Cosimo, if you can comment on that just a minute.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, especially because we are talking about very high expensive drugs. So that it was not all cases, but I mean, it took advantage of the different prices that different countries have on medicines. So for the parallel trading case, was about providing medicines at a lower price for people that couldn't afford that. So that is often that is often the case. But we also have, however, cases where, as I was said before, rich people want to get the best medicine that they can get, basically. So that's not always the primary case, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the subject is quite interesting, especially because it's a two-sided organized crime on the one hand, but then a lot of the role of the government as well and what they cannot address. So there's definitely a lot of research and more research to be done. We have 1 minute left, so I really want to thank all the participants for their presentations, incredibly insightful. Thank you so much and well done.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. This talk was just one of 85 from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime. To get access to the rest, head over to oc24.heysummit.com. Thanks for listening.